I just want to thank everyone for coming. This is the work, that we get to do. Um, when I approached this to the Northwest Regional team, it was really without question or hesitation. It was like, yeah, we're going to do it. We'll pay for it and we'll figure it out on the back end. And again, Bruce, Tracy, the Northwest team, everyone that has kicked in because we see the need and willing to do the work. I just can't thank you enough. Dr. Caprice Hollins, 2 minutes. And she said, I'm not quite sure if I have room. I don't know if this is going to be a good fit. And we just, once we started talking, we hit it off. And I was like, I didn't know if I was going to have to write the baby please letter. Like, what do we need to do? Because the conversation that we had was so rich. And I asked her to do this because I actually believe in what Keller Williams is doing, and our morals and our values. And what she brings to the table is in such alignment with what we have as a team, as a Keller Williams team. And yes, there are gaps, and yes, there's work to do. And so it is just my honor to bring on Ms. Caprice, Dr. Caprice Hollins.
Yeah, thank you, Dee Dee. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to engage you. This has been a long time coming. People don't always realize what's happening in the background, all the calls and the emails and that sort of thing. So make sure you thank Dee Dee and all those folks that she mentioned, whether it's in the chat or what have you, so that no matter how you feel about your time with me today, that you've already shown gratitude just for the effort that was put into making this happen. Tell me again who, Bruce, is the person that is the host that I can connect with periodically?
Yes, Tracy is the host.
Okay, so I'm going to have them go into groups here shortly. And it's one of two things. Either you make me the host and you're the co-host by just kind of passing it on to me, and I can manage that, or you just stay tuned and I will tell you what I need you to do. I actually prefer to do it myself, but I can guide you in what I'm needing. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're just going to start out with a question. Let's see. So there we go. And so I'm curious to know, when you were growing up, let's see, do you see my second screen over there? Casey, I see you. Do you see my screen? Nod your head. Okay. So when you were growing up, what were the messages that you received about talking about race, racism, and race relations? So what I'm asking, Rochelle, is, was it talked about when you were a kid? And there's a couple of ways that you can think about this question. So for example, Shane, you might think about your K-12 education experience. Was it a part of the curriculum? Did your teachers talk with you about race, racism, race relations? If it was a part of the curriculum, Alicia, I want you to go a little bit deeper and think about, from whose perspective was the story told? It was actually from Dee Dee's uncle that I learned to think about the African experience in this country as Blacks being enslaved rather than Blacks as slaves. Can you hear the difference in that? It wasn't until later in life that I started thinking about the Japanese being interned to Japanese Americans being incarcerated. In my K-12 education experience, I didn't learn a lot other than kind of the like slavery or Martin Luther King. And so I'm asking you, what did you learn? Right? What were the messages? Whose perspective was the story told? Another way you might think about this question is, what was it like with your relatives growing up? Did you have the kind of grandparents where before you went to go and visit them, Karina, your parents had to prepare you for what your grandparents were going to say about those people? And if so, what was it that your grandparents would say about those people? Were you the curious child where you would point out differences, and if so, how did your parents respond to you noticing differences? I not only have the privilege to work with a lot of different organizations, we also facilitate a number of different topics. And one of them is called Talking with Children About Race. And I always tell participants, if you're not talking with the children in your life about what's going on in this country right now, they're still making meaning of it. They're just left to do it without your guidance. And so what I'm proposing to you, Lou, is that even if there was no conversation about race, racism, race relations, that you still form thoughts, ideas, preconceived notions, not only about people who were different from you, but also towards people who identify with your same racial group. And I'm wondering, what were those thoughts, ideas, and preconceived notions? So here's my question. When you were growing up, what were the messages that you received about race, racism, and race relations? All right, so we're gonna put you in groups. So I've already forgotten your name. I do that. I meet new people all day long. Bruce has told me 2 times. Oh, I got breakout rooms.
You're the host now, Caprice.
Okay, I'm gonna put you in breakout rooms. Let me see how many it will let me do as a max. Oops, let's see. Let me do this really quickly. And as I give you the instructions, so what you're gonna do is you're gonna have, let me see how many I get here first, and then I'll tell you how many minutes you have, because I want to make these groups as small as I possibly can. It looks like I can do 50. So you're going to be in groups of 4 to 5. So you will have, let's see, so I'll give you 2 minutes each. So you'll have 2 minutes each to respond to this question. So this is going to be 10 minutes total. And when you're the one sharing, if you run out of things to say, I don't want anyone listening to ask questions or to say anything about how they connect or prompt for more. I want you to just go to complete silence during that 2 minutes. I think everybody has at least 2 minutes worth of something to say about what it was like for them growing up. And I want you to just have that opportunity, even in that silence, to think about what more might you say. Where did you grow up? What did you hear? Mixed messages, whatever it was. Now I do need a timekeeper. So if somebody in your group would be willing to be the timekeeper, you get to practice interrupting. Because once that 2 minutes is up, no matter where that person is at in the conversation, that timekeeper is going to interrupt and say that it's the next person's turn, because I don't want for that person to take up the next person's time. Is this making sense to you? So you're going to have, so some of you are going to be in groups of 5, some of you will be in groups of 4, so it'll be 10 minutes. So those of you who are groups of 4, it'll be a little bit more than 2 minutes. So 2 minutes each. You're just going to rotate. You're going to be in complete silence as you're listening. And then once your 2 minutes is up, your timekeeper will tell you to rotate. So as soon as you get into your groups, just volunteer to be the timekeeper and then get started. So I would love to hear from some of you, and this could be where you speak, Sloan. And particularly if somebody did not get a chance, but I'd love to hear from maybe 2 or 3 of you as a large group. And I know that some of you began entering into chat. I will actually, we will be using chat quite a bit. I will let you know when we're going to be using chat, when I'd like you to enter your thoughts in there, and then we'll do breakout groups. So when, like, whoever shares first, whoever takes that risk to go first, and again, Sloan, I just wanted you to know that you were speaking with the whole, 200 plus people, but I would like you to use chat to communicate whenever somebody speaks. Let them know what you're hearing, or that you appreciate the risk that they took, or if you had a similar experience. If you look in chat now, you'll see that I have these lines drawn across. That lets me know that we're at a new place or a new part of conversation, so that I know where to stop as I try to read through the different things that are that have been chatted. The one thing that I don't want you to do is I don't want you to start a conversation in chat, because I really want us to be present with each other's stories and what I am going to be sharing with you today. So Sloan, I just want to open it up to you. Are you open to, would you like to share, or I just want to give you that opportunity if you're interested.
I don't mind at all. I'm Pacific Islander. My mother and my two aunts were born in Tahiti. My two aunts are dark skinned and my mom is not. And so there was definite differences in how they were treated. And so we were kind of sensitive to that in our household. And it still is a wedge in some ways with our family. So I didn't experience that like my mom and my two aunts did, but I just think I was a little more sensitive or aware sometimes when I entered into a venue with how they could feel.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sloan. And take a look in chat. A couple of people have chatted. Appreciate Samantha bringing up colorism. Great term to look up if you're not aware of what that word means. You know, people always say, is there homework? There'll be lots of homework. So you can, do a little searching later for that. Whenever somebody goes first, they always think that that's an invitation for others to do the same. And so if you would be open to sharing, could I get maybe two people to enter into chat? So the first two people just enter that you're willing to. Okay, so KW and Damien. Okay, let's do those two. And I see I've got Howard and Cole and Dana. We won't have enough time for everyone. Let's hear from the KW and Damien. Let's start there.
Okay, so KW, my name is Josh. I'm just covering at the front desk right now. I'm born and raised in Idaho Falls, Idaho, moved to Salt Lake City, Utah for 10 years, and then spent a year in Manhattan before returning to Idaho. So it's just funny to see how much of a bubble it is here. And Idaho really is just an extension of Utah, basically. So the mindset is everybody lives the same way that everyone does here. It's like a huge white population, very large LDS population. So growing up here as a gay man, I didn't come out after high school. And then the biggest thing is people here do have tendencies towards racism and things like that. There is a major problem. And people shy away from it and don't want to talk about it because they can't understand it and they've never experienced it. So they feel like it's not a problem. But just
is that when you were a child, Josh?
Child, it's just like just race was never discussed, especially like in school and things like that. Like, oh, slavery happened at the end. Martin Luther was a person at the end. They never got into it. So yeah, that was never discussed. Parts of my family have said things, and I know they have the wrong mindset. So, and like I said, people don't want to discuss it here. It makes them uncomfortable because they think it's not happening. But just like last month, someone gave.
Hold on, Josh. Just for right now, I just want to know what it was like for you as a child. And if you can connect with what Josh was saying about it wasn't talked about and maybe hearing things that were not okay, then I'd like you to just let him know in some ways. And Josh, our whole day today is going to be talking about racism. So let me hear from, and I lost the name. There was somebody after Josh that had agreed to go, whoever that person
Damien.
was. Okay, Damien, thank you.
Hi. So I grew up in the Yakima Valley here in Washington, a small town called Zilla. It's very similar to what Josh was saying. It's kind of like its own little bubble. Mostly white people. We had a few people of color in our town, but not that many. racism for me was really just described through history in our history classes. And I think that was really blanketed by a white perspective on things. So yeah, it was definitely taught as like a thing of the past, and it wasn't really around anymore. And it wasn't until I heard I grew up with my grandparents. It wasn't until I heard my grandfather say some pretty questionable things that I was like, wow, people are still have that mindset and talking like that. So it was really eye-opening and kind of a shocker that someone so close to me was still thinking like that and had so much hate towards a certain type of person.
Yeah, thank you, Damien. Now, I know some other people had put their names as being willing to share, but what I want to know is there someone that has a different experience other than what was already shared? Somebody that has a different experience who would, okay, so Dana, would you share?
Hi, everybody. So as I told my group, race, I was always aware of it as a child. My dad is very, very African American centered and centric. And so it was always a conversation for us in the household, watching what you do around whites. How do you act when it comes to whites? The differences between us as African Americans and whites. And so one of my first interactions personally was my second grade teacher. Her name was Miss Heath. And I'll never forget, I clearly dealt with racism as a second grader, her making strict differences between the Black children and the white children. And I was that person because my dad taught us at a young age, you speak up, you speak about it. My dad would come, he was adamant about how his children would be treated. And so because of how adamant my dad was and how he really taught us to use our voice, it was a struggle dealing with a teacher as a kid, and not use my voice in a disrespectful way and not use my voice even as, towards a white. He just really taught us, you speak up, you speak, you look in someone's face, you speak for yourself, and you speak for others where things are wrong. And so she just could not take that. And I've just never forgotten from a second grader, hey, there are real differences in life. And so it's been one of those things where we just learn to deal with it and we learn to adapt to it. Doesn't make it right, but that was my first real encounter with racism.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you. I can pick one more that has a different story or experience from anything that has been shared so far.
I'll go, Dr. Hollins.
Okay.
So I grew up in a white Christian school. And so the narrative in that particular school is God loves everyone. I don't remember that I heard God is colorblind, but that he loves everyone from all races. And then looking at the history that we were taught, I never saw myself in the history book until February when we talked about racism and slavery. And somehow that it was just in that moment, like in that time capsule for February. And the only faces that I ever saw was Martin Luther King and Harriet Tubman. And then we moved on. And it wasn't until I was older that I recognized that some of the things that I was experiencing really was because of the color of my skin. And in talking with my parents later on, they wanted to try to shield or protect me from it. So they thought that going to the private white Christian school was somehow going to release me from the racism that the world had to offer me. And so that was a heavy lift, and just moving along, I did the same thing, put my kids in private school, and my son asked me in February, and when he was in third grade, Mom, were we always slaves? Were we born slaves? Is that who we are? Is that our identity? And it hit me like a ton of bricks that I was preconditioned to think that that's where my rich history came from.
Thank you, Dee Dee. Now, I want you to know that there will be times when you'll think or feel you wish you had more time. You wish you had more time in the groups, the small groups. You'll wish you had more time in the larger group to share. And I want you to know that you do have more time. Now, you won't have more time right now, but you know, even when I teach a 4-day intensive graduate course on these issues, I will tell my students, I hope you leave here with more questions than you do answers. I'm hoping that you will take the things that I am asking you, the things that I'm going to share with you today. I'm hoping that you will continue to talk about them, that you won't wait until the next time you have a diversity workshop, that you'll pick up the phone and talk with relatives, that you'll call coworkers, and that you'll continue to process even this kind of question that I'm asking you, what were you taught growing up? Now, when I ask this question, themes tend to come up, and I want to share with you what those themes are. But before I do that, I want you to know that when I'm talking with you, I never mean all Blacks, all Indigenous, all whites, all Asians, all Latinx. So I want to get that out the way. Even with your mics turned on or turned off, I want to see everybody's lips moving. I want you to say, she never means all. So let's just say that. She never means all. All right.
She never means all.
All right, Lorraine, thank you. So now if at some point during our time together, if someone says, while I'm talking about their group, I'm not like that, I don't do that, I'm different from that, I want your help in reminding your coworker that I never mean all. Will you do that for me? All right. When I ask this question, whites commonly tell stories of colorblind thinking. It is very common for them to grow up in a town where there are very few people of color, if any. It isn't until they leave that town, go off to college, or join an organization like Home Expert that they begin to talk about race. When it is talked about as children, it's often talked about as a thing of the past. Even when children grow up in very liberal households, what whites will tell me is that they discover that about the time they reach dating age, that their parents didn't mean embrace diversity in that kind of way, right? So they get these mixed messages, as someone said earlier. Right? When whites grow up in the military, or even if they're the minority amongst majority people of color, their best friend was a person of color, they'll often say that race wasn't talked about. Only they'll use it as proof that race wasn't an issue. And what I want you to think about, if that was the case for you, is it that race wasn't an issue? Or is it that the people of color in your life didn't talk about it with you, right? Why might that be? See, we know that research shows that white parents of white children, even white parents of children of color, tend not to talk with their children about racism, about race relations. And I think what that's about is that they know that there are white people who will see differences as negative. They don't want their children to grow up having those same thoughts, attitudes, and beliefs. And so the pendulum swings in the opposite direction, Joe, and the approach becomes to not notice. But when I ask people of color this question, I tend to get something very different.
Yeah.
So Sid, when I ask, for example, more recent immigrants of color this question, they'll often say, I didn't even know I was a person of color until I got here. See, they don't think of themselves in terms of a person of color, but what they discover is that whichever group they are most similar to, those are the barriers and stereotypes they're going to have to navigate. Now, the reason that I said more recent immigrants is because, Kara, I think of our nation as a nation of immigrants. And tell me if I said your name wrong, if it's Kara, not Kara. It's Kara? Okay. Kara.
Kara.
Kara. Okay, thank you, Kara. See, I think of this nation as a nation of immigrants. Now, of course, I don't think of Native Americans as immigrants, right? I'm currently on the land of the Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples, right? These are people who stewarded these lands long before, before I got here or my relatives got here, I'm actually have it prepared. I want you to enter into chat if you know whose land you're on. And if you don't know whose land you're on, there's some homework for you. I just entered in a link so that no matter where you are in the country, you can Google and find out who took care of that land, whose land was that before your people or the people that are currently there. Now, this doesn't mean that the Coast Salish and Duwamish tribes are not still here, but certainly we want to recognize colonization. So I'm seeing people enter that in. And I don't think of African Americans as immigrants. We know how they got here. Dee Dee just talked about, learning about that history through the enslavement of African Americans. I actually question whether or not we should consider Mexican Americans as immigrants when we realize whose borders actually got crossed. But everybody else in my mind is an immigrant. It's just a matter of what generation did your ancestors come to this country. Now, when I ask Asians and Latinx, there's often a theme around assimilation. And let me tell you what I mean by this. If you identify as white, and if you're not quite sure, you're probably white, right? But if you identify as white and your ancestors came to this country during the turn of the 20th century, this was a time in our country when millions of people immigrated here, right, Lori? Millions. And they typically came from Europe, though not all. They didn't come here as white, did they? They came here as Irish, Italian, Polish, Germans, Jewish, all of these different identities. And what did they discover? They discovered if their ethnicity was known, they would experience discrimination. They were referred to as savages and lazy. The jobs that they could get were often the most dangerous jobs, usually the lowest paying jobs, which caused them to have to live in very impoverished living conditions. And this also meant that there was often a lot of crime, right? People will, for some reason, associate crime with race, as if people are born with a criminal gene, and fail to recognize that anywhere that we have poverty, we often have higher crime rates. Are y'all with me on this? And your ancestors wanted opportunity and access, so what did they do? They began this assimilation process. The way in which I describe assimilation is that assimilation is a way to make white people feel more comfortable being around you. So Irish, Italian, German, Scottish, they didn't, some of you may not know this, but you might not have the last name of the name that your ancestors came to this country with. They didn't pass on their language to their children. They began to change the way that they dressed, the foods that they ate, any cultural markers that would cue someone else in to their ethnicity. Well, Asians and Latinx are not the only groups who have attempted assimilation. I'm talking about themes. They too know that a discrimination exists. They too want access and opportunity for their families. And so they might not pass down their language to their children. They might give their children more American sounding names. And the reason I do quotey fingers, Josh, is because what is an American name, right? Even my name, Caprice, is French, right? The only true American names, Regina, are those names that we make up in this country, like Shaniqua. In other words, they don't have an origin anywhere else, or indigenous names, right? The difference, though, is that when people of color try to assimilate, it's near impossible unless they are white passing, right? What I'm saying is that even in this webinar, in this virtual training, I can usually see who the people of color are. Now, I can't always tell. Right? Now, Steph, you appear to me to be a person of color. You could be Latinx, you could be indigenous, you could be Black, you could be multiracial, you could also be white. I don't know. And then there are people like Dee Dee or Tony or Joe, where phenotypically I can see that you are a person of color. So when people of color try to assimilate, no matter how hard they work, no matter what they do to try to blend in or to try to be accepted, they will always hold at least second-class citizenship. Whereas those of you who identify as white, I don't know if you're Irish, Italian, German, or some combination of those things. Now, when I ask Blacks and natives this question, they'll say one thing in common, and that is that they will teach their children, you can't trust all white people. Now, I know that this is sometimes hard for white people to hear, that people of color are teaching their children this, but I want you to think about this like talking to your children about stranger danger. If you have children, it is likely that at some point in time, you decided that it was time to start talking with them about strangers. You didn't know how often to talk with them about it. You didn't always know what the right way was to do it. You weren't given a manual, but you wanted to keep your children safe, so you just began talking with them about it. You didn't want your children to, while they're playing in the park, you didn't want them to run off to the man who is standing in front of the van inviting them to pet their puppy. You didn't want to, scare them so much about strangers that you went to go and introduce them to your coworker or to a friend and have them start shouting, stranger danger, stranger danger. So you just did the best that you could with what you had. And the same thing is true for parents of color, of children of color. We want our children to know that racism is real. And we want to prepare them for it. We're not trying to tell them that all white people will treat them badly because of the color of their skin, but we do need to prepare them for the realities that exist. And we're not given a manual, so we just give it our best shot. Now, in addition to this, Blacks will teach their children that you have to work twice as hard to be seen for the talents, gifts, brilliance that you bring, for example, into the workplace. We will also teach our children how to navigate white space. So it's not what to do if you get pulled over, it's what to do when you get pulled over. I've been talking with my children about these things since they were really young, not only about racism, Lena, but also about classism, sexism, ableism, homophobia. See, I needed my son to know, when my son was in the 9th grade, he was already over 6 feet tall, growing a beard, wearing size 16 wide shoes. And I needed him to understand, Bob, that the moment he steps out our front door, our socioeconomic status was not going to protect him, is not going to protect him for what people will do with the color of his skin. This prepared him for 2 weeks into his college experience. He went off to Pullman. He is asked by someone that he goes to school with if he would go and pick her up from a frat party. It's nighttime. My son and his roommate, who's also African American, tell her, yes, we'll walk you home. And so they go to this frat party. They're just waiting outside. They're not invited. They're not members, so they can't go in. And 2 white guys, they're getting ready to go in, and they walk up to him and they say, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. And my son said, oh no, we're not going in. We're just here to pick up Nina. Can you let her know we're outside waiting? And they said, no, we won't let her know. And when we come back out here, if you're still here, there's going to be trouble. Now, I'm glad, Megan, that my son didn't turn to his roommate and say, I think we can take these 2 guys. I'm glad that they didn't let their ego get in the way, or who was right or who was wrong. See, they thought Nina, unfortunately, is going to have to find her own way home because they left. Now, the reason that I'm saying that I'm grateful, and the reason that I talk with my kids about racism unapologetically is because my son came home alive to me that Thanksgiving. See, I know people that their stories don't end the way my children's stories have ended so far. Right? And until we do a better job in this nation of talking about racism, parents of color, of children of color, are going to continue to tell their children about what they might face as they go out into the world. Now, I had said, Ramona, that it makes sense to me why we don't know how to have healthy conversations, productive conversations about race. Now I'm going to represent people of color. If I have known as a person of color my whole life that my race matters, and I join home experts and I'm engaging a white person, one of my colleagues, somebody that I'm becoming friends with, about an experience that I have, and they say or do something that invalidates my experiences or triggers an emotional reaction in me. My role, if I want to help move the race conversation forward, is to become genuinely curious about why they see things the way they see things. Now, Dwight, that's not an easy thing to do, right? To lean in and to wonder, why might they think the way that they think? Why are they saying what it is that they're saying? See, in my mind, I might be thinking, oh, no, she didn't, right? No, she didn't just say that. But if I want to help move the race conversation forward, I've got to become genuinely curious about why white people are where they're at in the conversation. And more importantly, how does that white person become genuinely curious about why I see things the way I see things? And in race conversations, Jody, the reason why I say more importantly that white people become genuinely curious about the experiences of people of color is because what people of color tend to find is that white people want to be the experts of our reality. See, they get to determine whether or not we're playing the race card. They determine whether or not, if we would have just worked harder, then we would have gotten that promotion, or if Ahmaud Arbery hadn't had a criminal background, or if William Green hadn't been drunk in his car, then they would have been alive. See, they determine it, even though for most white people, they haven't even begun to explore what it means to be white until they became adults. See, herein lies our dilemma. If we don't figure out how to have these conversations, we are never going to be able to dismantle institutional racism. I love this thing. I don't know who said it, Shay, but it goes, the process is the first part of the product. We can't get to dismantling something that we're not willing to talk about. See, my brothers and sisters of color and those that are on that gender binary, we've got to stop shaming and blaming white people into understanding. If we really thought about it, it should make sense to us why white people are where they're at. It's not a part of our curriculum. See, people of color learn about racism through their families and on their own. It's not through school. They're taught to think in terms of colorblind thinking. It's not usually until they're adults. They're socialized to think the way that they think. So why would they be any place different than where they're currently at? We are blaming individuals for an institutional problem, for a systemic problem. And whites have got to stop being the experts. They've got to stop determining what our reality is. This would be like me, let's say we're in a building, we're in a workshop, and someone in a wheelchair comes in and they say, I'm sorry I'm late. It was difficult getting into this building. And I said to them, what are you talking about? You're just making excuses. And I proceeded to give them instructions based on how I got into this building as an able-bodied person who's never had to navigate my way around being in a wheelchair. Now, I'm not talking about the white person who is overtly racist. I'm not talking about the person who doesn't care, who believes in the inferiority of people of color and the superiority of whites, right? I'm talking about people who were not taught to talk about race and who were taught to believe that racism was a thing of the past. Now, I'll be honest with you, and Ryan, I see you nodding your head and that you have something maybe that you would like to share. And I do want to open this up for dialogue. I'm going to put you into groups for a moment, but I would like you to know a little bit about myself. So I'm going to share my screen with you. And then I will give you an opportunity to talk in groups, because there are almost 250 people. So we're going to be using chat throughout. I'm going to put you in groups so that you have opportunities to process what it is that I'm saying in smaller groups. Does that make sense to you all? Nod your head. Okay, all right. My mom is white. She grew up Catholic. She married at a time when women's roles were to stay at home and take care of the children. She had my older brothers and sisters, Mark, Mike, Ted, and Kelly. They are blonde hair and blue eyes, right? She did something that wasn't typical at the time, and that is she got a divorce. White woman who's Catholic gets pregnant out of wedlock by a Black man at a time in our country when interracial relationships were still illegal in some states. This pretty much severed my mother's already difficult relationship with her parents. I'm the adorable one in all these pictures, Tim, if you're trying to figure out which one is me. So my mother also had my younger sister who's also multiracial. So she was a single parent raising 6 children on welfare. This is the first time that I ever met my dad. I'm in 4th grade. I grew up in Seattle in the Rainier Valley. I went to Franklin High School, Mercer Middle School, and John Muir Elementary. And I've gone to other schools because we moved a lot, but that's primarily Howard where I lived. I didn't meet my father's family until I went to my dad's funeral about 5 years ago. He lived in Texas, and I got to meet my older brother and sister and aunts and uncles and other relatives, even those that are here in Seattle. My grandparents were a Black couple that didn't have children of their own, Marion and George Simmons. They met my mother when she was pregnant with me. My mother started working for them in their barbecue restaurant and catering business. I've been to a lot of bar mitzvahs in my life. And they start calling her mama and papa, right? My mother starts calling them mama and papa. And Megan, the story in my family is that once I'm born and can talk, I start calling them grandma and grandpa, and that my siblings follow suit. All of my most of my relatives growing up were my mother's best friends. Those are my aunts and uncles, and their children are my cousins. So my children don't ask me how is Aunt Connie related to us, or how is Aunt Carmela related to us, because none of it makes any sense in our family. Now, my mother, I met my father when I was in the 4th grade because my older sister Kelly dies at the age of 14 of something called viral encephalitis. My mom wants to get us off of welfare, JP, so she joins the Teamsters Union. She goes and works on the Alaskan pipeline. And while she's there, she volunteers as a firefighter. My mother would travel back and forth between Alaska and Washington. And one of the times when she got home, Tanya, or is it Tanya, or is it Tanya or Tonya? DeBow. Tonya?
Sorry, Tanya. It's Tanya.
Okay, so Tanya, one of the times when my mother got home, they got to talking. They realized that if something was to happen to my mom because she's doing dangerous work and we were living with our grandparents, that the state could disperse us. So they decided to legally adopt my mother at my mother's age of 41. My mother's birth certificate literally says, Renee, that her parents are Black and the age my grandparents would have been had they have given birth. Now, why am I telling you all of this, Amanda? Now, 2 reasons. I want to be honest with you because you're going to figure this out anyway. I love to be center of attention. I am actually a clinical psychologist. I didn't like that 50-minute one-on-one where it was all about you. So I changed up my profession, okay? Now, the more serious reason is that I want to fast forward to my graduate school experience. So my doctorate degree is in clinical psychology. I minored, Ken, in something called multicultural and community psychology. Now, I had no idea what that meant, Anita. I saw a paragraph description, thought it sounded fascinating. It changed my life. The entire first year, an entire year, we just did personal work, Rosemary, where they had us looking at, for example, our identities where we held privilege. And I thought, I don't have any privilege. I'm a woman of color, I grew up poor. Now, where it was really difficult for me was this idea that I would have bias. This was long before our nation was talking about things like implicit bias and stereotypes and all of that. And so the reason I was resistant to it, Linda, because I could always point to someone in my life as proof of my truth that I don't do that thing that I knew y'all did, right? And what I came to understand is not only do I have privilege, but that I also have bias. Not only do I have bias towards people who belong to groups that I don't identify with, I also hold bias towards people who share the same identities that I hold, right? So let me give you an example of that. I identify as a woman. I have judged every woman in this workshop, right? I'm judging you based on all for those of you who did not turn your camera on, listen, this is a mandatory opportunity to learn about racism. Of course I have judged you, right? I'm judging you based on the color of your hair. I'm judging you even based on intersections of your identity, like not just your gender, but your perceived race. Not just your gender and your perceived race, but your perceived age, your perceived class, your perceived sexual orientation. Now, let's not let men off the hook here. Of course, I have judged the men in this workshop too. I just wanted to make the point that I judge people who even share my same identity. Now, you should not be worried that I am judging you. You should be worried if I don't know that I'm judging you, right? See, what research shows is that when we don't bring what's in our unconscious to a level of consciousness, then we can't be intentional about making sure that it doesn't get in the way of how we treat one another in our hiring decisions, right? Now, that was a new concept for me in graduate school, this idea that I'm judging people. And I would have never told you that I was judging you if I didn't know that the reverse is also true, meaning that you have judged me. And you didn't need to meet me in order to judge me. The moment you read that email, right, that you had a mandatory learning opportunity to talk about racism, you started to form all kinds of thoughts, ideas, and preconceived notions in your mind. And I don't mind that other people are judging me. I know that people do it all the time. I do worry, though, when people don't know that they're judging me. Right? We know that the research shows that those who think they're operating under colorblind thinking, those who believe that they don't have biases or stereotypes, they're actually the ones who are doing the harm, right? Because they're not doing that active, intentional work. See, think about this. When I get ready to work with police officers, I don't need to meet those police officers to start to form ideas and thoughts and stereotypes about them no more than when I'm getting ready to work with attorneys or teachers or social workers. Even your location will change my stereotypes about you. See, when I'm getting ready to work with social workers in Tacoma or Seattle, I have a different set of assumptions when I'm traveling to Wenatchee to work with social workers. See, we're all doing it. We're all doing it. Now, it wasn't just around race that I struggled with these conversations. I have a brother that's gay. My older brother, Mark, he's the youngest of my 4 older siblings. I always knew he was gay. Didn't have the language for it, Marcus, but I did know that this brother was different from my other brothers. But it was not a surprise to us when he became a young adult, started performing under the name of Seneca Jones. I remember he won a Miss Joan Rivers lookalike contest. They flew him off to California. My sister and I would brag about this to all of our friends. I'm bragging to you right now, Carrie, right? He was Miss Gay Seattle, so that meant he was in the parade. Our entire family was proud of him. My mother was a was a bouncer at a gay bar that's still on Capitol Hill called Our Place. And when she passed away a couple of years ago, Our Place sent flowers. That was a huge honor to us because that was a lot of years ago. I have foster siblings who are biological siblings. Her shirt says "Dangerous Curves Ahead" if you're trying to figure that out. This picture was taken in the 70s. I think my headphones have come back in style. You might see folks wearing headphones like that now. And I have a younger sister who came into my life and our life at the age of 2. And even though our parents didn't stay married very long, she's still our sister. I have a brother that's a Republican. That's diversity in my family. My family tends to be more on the Democratic side. And I know that, typically, Gwen, I will get in my evaluations, my Republican brothers and sisters and those not on the gender binary will get upset about this. And I'm not saying it for any other reason to say that I could go on and on about the diversity in my family. The fact that my stepmother is from Thailand, or that I have a brother that's gay, or that I have all of this diversity does not make a difference. I'm not saying that it doesn't make a difference in how it enriched my life or how it's helped me to be more open to embracing diversity. What I'm saying is that it doesn't keep me from judging people from those groups. And I'm telling you this because I often hear people do the same thing that I used to do, by the way. They would point to people in their lives as proof of their truth that they don't have any work to do. I will to this day hear people say, "Oh, I don't judge. I work with someone who is." You can fill in the blank. I have children who are. I'm married to. I dated a Black guy once. That's my favorite joke, Kelly. Nobody ever laughs at it, but I still hear that. The truth of the matter is that the relationships with the people in your life are the relationships with the people in your life and no more. Because what happens is that we make people in our lives different from everybody else. See, I know my brothers. I know my mother. I make white women that I come across different from my mother. White men different from my brothers. One way to think about this is if you voted for Obama, that doesn't mean that you're not stereotyping the Black men, walking down the street. You've made Obama different from those Black men. These are the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about today. Some of the things that I'm going to share with you are going to run contrary to what you were taught growing up. And what I would like you to do is to think about to be curious about, what are you doing with what you're hearing me say? Where do you find yourself giving pushback? Where do you find yourself feeling defensive? What do you hear me say that aligns with what you already believe to be true? So you'll have opportunity and moments throughout to process. And that includes right now. So I'm going to put you in groups of about 4 or 5. You're going to have 10 minutes to just process, what are you hearing me say right now? I want you to be mindful that 10 minutes isn't a lot of time. So make sure that you give an opportunity for everybody to at least say something about what they're hearing, what they're doing with what they're hearing. All right, I'm going to get you in these groups so you all have time to share. So enter your name into chat if you're willing to take risk and share what you're hearing and what you're doing with what you're hearing. Okay, so Erica will go and it will always say your name, and then Joe. So you remember your second, Joe. Joe Extraordinario. Okay. And then, all right, so we'll take those 4. Hariuchi, and you'll tell me when I get on the phone with you, when you speak, if I'm saying your name right, and Amanda. So those will be the 4. We'll end there. Erica, Joe, Hariuchi, and Amanda.
I think one of the biggest things that I'm hearing, and something that's really important to me, and it's a conversation I started a couple of years ago because my best friend is New Mexican, and she adopted an African American child, and we talked a lot about like her son's identity and how she wanted to raise him. And you know, I've had friends, right? I never dated anyone though. Not that I wouldn't have. That's your joke. It's not funny. Anyway, we just weren't exposed to it. So if it didn't exist, it didn't exist, right? Like when people have something happen in their world that's so impactful, it's important to them. And it's kind of like we show up and we're like, why does this even matter? It's not a thing. And what I'm learning is it is a thing, right? Like we've been so isolated. Even though my family was like that, I was just kind of like, you guys are whatever, right? Like this isn't a thing. And I'm learning it is so much a thing. And we're only one generation, not even a full generation away from, well, I can't even describe just the disgusting, embarrassing things that we've done as human beings. Like, what are we going to do now today to change it? And I'm kind of one of those people, I want to talk about change. What are we going to do now to change it? And I think the first step is, it's a thing. So now we need to deal with it, right? Like, how are we going to deal with it? Because it's a thing. And if it isn't like this close to you, it's not important. And it needs to be.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Erica. Again, when you hear people share, you know, let them know that you hear them or you connect, or you know, if there's something that they say that you're wondering about, but you'll have to have a conversation outside of our time together. Who's next?
I am.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. It's Joe from Hawaii. I first want to give a shout out to our group because we had a very high level conversation with Lorraine, Samantha, and Becky. So thank you. What we talked about in our group chat and what I'd like to share is the fact that we were listening to what Dr. Hollins was saying and sharing. And I found myself writing down a lot of questions to challenge myself and my circle and my network to have these conversations. I wrote down ahas like when Dr. Hollins said, help move the race card forward, and ask yourself, where do you hold privilege? And then the big one to me, because I did relate with being a judging machine, which was writing down the question and answering it, how to get genuinely curious as to why or where white people are in the conversation. How do they see it? Because I give recognition that I grew up in a very multicultural, diversified family, group of people, friends. And so when I see something out of my norm, I'm quick to judge and challenge it, when in actuality, maybe approaching it with grace and curiosity may actually help move the conversation forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Thank you. And we have two other people that we have time for.
Hello?
Yes. How do I say your name?
Haruchi?
Haruchi. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Haruchi. I'm Black and Asian. We were just having a discussion. It was interesting in our group. One of the gentlemen laughed when I brought up a particular incident that recently happened on the news about a minority getting shot, and it was, what kind of came over me was the idea of how I needed to be patient, and how you talked about taking responsibility and having some emotional intelligence about who I'm talking to and their behavior based on what I'm saying. And also identifying with the idea that there is a big disconnect from what I feel like I go through. You know, the ideas of trying to work twice as hard or 3 times as hard to get ahead, and, you know, having that idea implanted in my head, because it was one of those my dad actually implanted in me. You got to work 2-3 times harder than a white person in order to get ahead. But that some of my peers or associates don't realize that. And it's not necessarily a discussion that you want to have or bring up, but it's always what would be really progressive, I believe, is acknowledgement. And in our group, we had kind of a idea confrontation as far as being social justice, having social justice and diversity and equality, but also, you know, talking about the Black Lives Movement and how it's so aggressive and all these other things. And the big disconnect for me there was the idea that we're just dealing with an injustice. And to be able to have that conversation about just acknowledging the fact that people are going through an injustice of your American citizens, your fellow brothers are telling you something that's affecting them and that they're having to go through, and the acknowledgement part, I think, would really help progress our situation. And I have to do my part too as a minority to explain and express that. But and it's just a mindset that we're in, so I have to be really aware and sensitive to their mindset, because at the end of the day, if I piss somebody off, it might affect my career at KW, right? Or whoever or wherever, right? If I'm like, no, that's some racist shit, like they're gonna be like, oh well, no, that's not. Like if I call somebody out on it, maybe that's how I see it, right? But yeah,
and it could be your life, and you know, and I'm sorry I'm interrupting you, but I'm got to get folks on a break. But I do what, so I'm hearing that even within our time together, where we are in a place to be learning, that you're talking about the loss of a life. You're talking about the murder of the young man yesterday, or the one that just occurred, that somebody laughed, right? And this is where I said, like, this is not easy for us as people of color to try to meet white people where they're at. That is not an easy thing. That is not an easy thing to do. And if I continue to work with you all, I will talk with you about strategies for how to engage, and also around discerning who to engage and who not to engage. What I do want white people to know is that every time we share a story, every time we talk about these experiences in our lives, we relive a little bit of that experience. And so really, these are opportunities. What you did in that moment was you gave someone an invitation to engage you, and that's not, and they didn't receive that invitation. And so I think I'm really just kind of, I'm stuck at that place, Hariuchi, of here we are to talk about race, and that was your experience. Now, the other person isn't here, so we don't know, but
Can I make one last comment, please?
Yes, please.
Yeah, well, to conclude with that, I was talking to the group to say, you know, if we started with just some small acknowledgement and together to keep an open mind and to deal with things as a group, as a standard, like our police situation, like treat everyone the same. It's not that hard, right? It's not about race, it's about equality. And so, I don't know, I just wanted to say that. It's really not about a race, it's about equality and justice, and about being open-minded and accepting.
Yeah, and I would just say, Hariuchi, that it shouldn't be about race, but it is about race. And we're going to talk about the difference between equity. Oh, I didn't, somebody's telling me my camera's off. Oh my gosh, thank you. Somebody's talking about, you know, you're talking about how if people just, like, if whites would just be open to hearing just even a little bit, that is actually doing something. I love the saying, listening is a form of action, right? And so is believing. But we'll get into that when we get into strategies.
Caprice,
yes.
before we go on break, because I kind of feel a little pain in his voice.
Yeah.
And for me, what I try to convey to everyone is we're not asking for Black criminals to be let go. What we're asking for is our day in court. We want to be if they do a crime, that they get the same justice that a white criminal gets. And then I don't live in a world where only Blacks do crime. The prisons have all types of people in them. But what people need to understand is the policeman cannot be our judge, jury, and executioner. Yeah. That there is a system of laws. Arrest them, put them on trial, and if they are found guilty, put them in jail. But to shoot Blacks as if we are dogs in a street cannot be accepted. So there is no acceptance, there is no understanding. I hate it when they go and pull up every dirty thing they can find about the person who was shot down in the streets. But you don't do that to white criminals. You don't even do that to Hispanic criminals. And so that is our pain, and that is what we are tired of being told, that it's something different. It's what's happening. We live in a country of laws. Treat us the same, arrest us, take us to court. Yeah. You do not have the right. A policeman does not have the right.
I am gonna interrupt only because. So here's what I'm trying to do in this presentation with you, is that people of color are talking about racism, and you can hear in the stories and the conversation that has already been shared that it isn't the talking about racism that's dividing us. It's the not talking about it that's dividing us.
Exactly.
And so the time that, let me tell you what I have planned for us today. So this is really a keynote. I'm going to get you a break in a moment, but this is really a keynote, which means I'm really here to do all the work, right? And then if you bring me back, we'll do some workshops. We can do workshops on bias and workshops on privilege and microaggressions and how to have these conversations with each other. My goal for today is I want you to leave with a common understanding, a common language around the work that we all need to do to get better at engaging across cultures and undoing systems of oppression. That's one of my goals. The other goal is I want you to know that when you're going in those groups, in the few moments that we have in the larger group context, that is us all practicing having courageous conversations. Right? When you speak up, when you begin to talk, tell your story. When you say, as a white person, my parents were racist, not kind of, sort of, but they were racist. They can be racist and you love them too. Both can be true. When we're telling our stories, that's us coming together, practicing, talking about the realities that exist. And I hope that as a result of our time together, that you're going to leave here with insight about yourself and insight about others. My goal in this time is not that we do everything that could be done or say everything that could be said during this time. I want you to leave to have a common language so that you can sit down together and be talking about these things that people of color, Blacks, have been waiting to have. Because we go to work and then I'm going to talk about it later. You're all going on break. I know there was a third person. The conversation has kind of gone in a different direction. So I'm going to ask that we're going to move away. We'll take so let me see. James, I'm just pulling out a name here. What's the culture for home expert? If I say you have a 10-minute break, is the culture that you'll take 15 or does 10 minutes mean 10?
10 means 10.
Okay, so we're gonna take a 15, well, we'll take a 12-minute break. So I want you to come back at 10 minutes till. And then I've got a lot for you that I think is gonna help you to be able to talk about these things. So turn off your camera. I think it is really equivalent to the private conversations that people of color are having with each other, right? That this is an opportunity, the beginning of an opportunity. You have an initiative that's happening, and it's an opportunity to figure out what is, and Dee Dee let me know, I've been saying home expert and it's Keller Williams, but what is Keller Williams willing to do to move these conversations forward? How are you willing to get messy? Are you willing to engage, particularly, you know, when people of color are sharing and talking and they are giving of themselves? What are you going to do with that? Are you going to push it away, laugh at it, whatever it is, or are you going to lean in and get curious? And I think what Harauchi said was really, really critical, which is what white people can do. Like the first step really is listen and believe. Listen and believe our reality. Now we're now time to get started. And so let me close my door. I would like to, I want to go through what I have planned for you all today, because I think, I really do believe that maybe not for all of you, but for most of you, it's going to help you to think about what is it that you can do. And so let me share my screen with you. This model that I share with you, everybody look at your microphones and make sure that they're turned off. Make sure that you have your microphones. And again, if, you know, Dee Dee and others are working to try to move beyond just this one time, there are lots of things. This is just the beginning, just trying to get everybody on the same page. And so I'm going to share with you what does social justice look like. And this is a model that was developed by Daryl and David Sue. They're Asian American psychologists, and we adapted their model to make it more inclusive. Now, when you hear me talking about this work, I want you to know that I'm talking about class and gender and ability and age and all of these areas where we categorize and dismiss people because of their identity. What you're going to hear me doing, though, is using race as a model to teach you how to effectively engage across cultures. Now, we do that for two reasons. One is that, first of all, if I took you through a workshop on implicit bias or on microaggressions, we talk about racial bias or racial microaggressions or racial privilege. I am not proposing that I'm here to teach you everything that you need to do as it relates to all of these different areas. I trust that y'all are smart enough to take whatever I'm teaching you and apply it to these different areas. The other reason I use race as a model is because what will happen in cross-cultural dialogue is that people of color will bring up their racial experiences. And whites will often do what I refer to as the Me Too phenomenon before the Me Too movement, right? The Me Too phenomenon is where whites will bring up, what about class? What about age? What about ability? So they'll go to their identity where they've experienced oppression. Most people of color can talk about class. They can talk about sexism. They can talk about ableism. And what they're inviting white people to do is to talk about race. So when we're talking about race, when white people go to another identity, it actually increases the racial divide rather than minimizes it. We have got to learn to sit in the tension, like the tension we just all experienced earlier, that this is personal. people are feeling, and we can't do this work without allowing the feeling to be present. And once white people begin to feel, they begin to move away. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. Now, I do want you to know that when I'm talking about this work, I'm really talking about any group that historically and presently, due to policies, past and present, where policies and practices that have created an unlevel playing field. So I am not talking about how someone gets treated because of the color of their hair or because of their height. I'm really talking about institutional and systemic isms that are embedded in the fabric of our nation, okay? Now, one of the things when people, so it's very common for whites to say, tell me what I can do. This is one of the things that you can do, which is awareness work. Awareness work is personal work. Awareness work is about you and no one else. It's not about they, those, them out there. It's where I, Caprice, look at how have I been socialized? What identities do I hold where I have privilege? What are my stereotypes? Where are my biases showing up? This is actually the hardest work of all 4 bodies of work, because each of us have spent a lifetime developing a sense of who we see ourselves to be. So the moment we start doing awareness work, this is where we start to feel. So for example, let me tell you, so when I was doing awareness work in graduate school, I'm looking at where I have privilege. So after my early childhood experience of trying to tell people I am not one race, I am 2 races, I got tired of it and decided, you know what, as a young adult, I'm just going to identify racially as Black because that's how society treats me, right? When I was a kid, I'd write my own little box, MIXED, but no matter what I said or did, our society saw me as Black. Now, ethnically, I identify as white and Black. That means that there are some cultures, there's some things about me that culturally align more with white culture. There are some things about me culturally that align more with Black culture. So racially, I identify as Black. Ethnically, I identify as multicultural. Right? Now, as I'm in graduate school, I come to realize that I have privilege. Turn on your mic. Anchor read. All right. I come to realize that I have privilege as a light-skinned Black person. And I realized that when I was identifying solely as Black, I was not making any distinctions between what it's like in this country being a light-skinned Black person versus a dark-skinned Black person. And I realized that I had been invalidating the experiences of dark-skinned Black people. There are other ways in which I realized that I had colluded with racism. Okay? So I remember when I was a young adult, I'd meet white people and they would say to me, sometimes, I don't think of you as Black. And my response would be, thank you. I didn't start sharing that with people until about 3 years ago. I was essentially, by saying thank you for not thinking of me like those Black people over there. Now I want you to enter into chat. What do you think are some of the emotions that began to surface for me as I realized I have colluded with racism and that I have invalidated the experiences of darker skinned Black people? Enter into chat. What do you think are some of the emotions? Absolutely, Alicia. Shame and guilt. Shame and guilt. It wasn't until 3 years ago that I could tell that last story. When white people began to when they began to lean in and realize that their colorblind thinking has done harm, that the fact that they have people in their lives as people of color and that has kept them from doing the work, when they've ignored ways in which they hold privilege simply because of the color of their skin, they will feel shame and guilt. A lot of times in just doing this presentation, white people will say, I don't like that you made white people feel shame, or you made white people feel bad for being white. I'm not trying to make white people feel bad for being white. I'm not even trying to make them feel shame or guilt. But if they're doing this work, shame and guilt is a normal part of their racial and ethnic identity development. In other words, it is a normal part of an awakening. Any good, kind, loving, moral, ethical white person who realizes that when they intended good have actually done harm is going to feel guilt and shame. The problem is that when many white people start to feel the guilt and shame, that they will retreat from the work. And they will stay at their basic ways in which they were taught to see race. They will continue to operate under the myth of meritocracy, meaning that anybody can get ahead if they just worked hard. They will ignore or invalidate the fact that race does matter in this country. And so the thing that keeps me hopeful, Amira, is that there are also white people who will, in spite of the guilt and shame, will continue to lean in and will move through that guilt and shame so that it's not controlling them. It's not what is the thing that is the most surface, and they will become allies. And we need white allies. No one ever in this country, no marginalized group has ever been able to pull itself up by their bootstraps. It's always taken those who are oppressed with those who oppress, working to change the laws, working to redistribute power. Are you all with me on this? Now, I commonly hear people of color saying, I don't have any work to do. Why do I have to be in this workshop? I live this every day. Why am I here just so white people can learn? And I want you to know that you need to be doing this work too, because people of color are not free from subtly internalizing what racism has done to us. We have internalized these messages about ourselves as people of color, right? And so we have to unpack what are we thinking about even our own race? What stereotypes and biases? Somebody had mentioned colorism. How are we hurting each other? How are we playing a role in that? And we are not here just to educate white people. I don't think we can move the race conversation forward if white people had to learn just from white people. I'm actually very afraid of that thought, that any white person I've ever come across that has become an ally, that it has come from the gifts that people of color have been willing to give them, right? We have to learn too. Just because we are people of color doesn't mean we understand how racism operates. It doesn't mean that we understand it at an institutional or a systemic level. We can experience it every day and still see it from an individual perspective rather than from a systemic perspective. But it's hard work. Now, our work might look different, but I promise you, we all have work to do. Now, knowledge is the other body of work. I love what PricewaterhouseCoopers says, that a workplace cannot be diverse if the people who work there cannot be themselves. So the fact that I see diversity in this virtual training does not make Keller Williams a diverse place to work. If I cannot bring my hairstyle to work, if I can't speak Spanish or Mandarin, if we have a policy of this is America, speak English. By the way, that's like one of my pet peeves. It's amazing to me how in our schools, we see our schools that have multiple languages as some of the more kind of like quality schools, right? We see speaking another language as a value, but then when it comes to our workplaces, when it comes to our society, we say speak English, this is America. And if we go back to the history of whites immigrating to this country, it wasn't until they had children that their children could speak English. Okay? So how is it that we can be a welcoming and inclusive environment if we don't understand the people that we work with and the people that we're here to serve? Because what happens is we end up adapting or adopting white standards as a way of engaging. Even people of color who are in leadership positions will uphold white values, white norms, white ways of engaging without even realizing that that's what they're doing. So what I'm suggesting, and what Daryl and David Sue is suggesting, is that we take out the time to learn about the different people that we work with and the different people that we serve. And you're never going to know all things about all cultures. You're not even going to know it about your own culture. But to think that Keller and Williams is a welcoming place if race isn't even talked about, if you're not intentional about what are the things that you need to do to make it welcoming and inclusive. If I am Muslim and I don't have a place to pray, if I'm Jewish and the time that we take off for holidays is Christmas, but I have to take off my own vacation time for Yom Kippur, then you don't have a welcoming and inclusive workplace. If I'm a lesbian and I can't go back to work and talk about what me and my wife did this weekend, then you don't have a welcoming and inclusive workplace. Now, one of the things I had to do in graduate school was I had to study different cultures. And one of the things that research shows is that whites and Asians tend to have a take-turn style of communicating, right? They tend to be rule followers. They tend to follow protocol. So if I put you all in a group and it was made up of Asians and whites, and I said you had 10 minutes to talk, it's highly likely that they would make sure that that time is fairly evenly distributed and you'd follow that prompt. Now, this is a good time to remember that I never mean all, right? Now, we know that Blacks and Latinx, we tend to tell stories when we're engaging. We're going to get to the point, you just got to give us a little bit of time, right? We tend to speak through our bodies. We tend to interrupt. Our volume might raise. Now, let's say that a white person is in a group with Blacks and Latinx, and they didn't take out the time to learn about Black culture. And we were given a prompt, and that white person is trying to figure out, how do I get into this conversation? We're laughing, we're talking, we're interrupting, and what that person doesn't realize is when I inhale, that's when you jump in. And if you don't jump in, then I don't think you have anything to say. Y'all with me on this? Now, when that white person leaves that situation, how is that type of behavior viewed by white culture? Enter that into chat. How is, for example, interrupting viewed by white culture? Rude. Absolutely, Claudia. Absolutely, Tanya. It's viewed as rude. So people of color, at the end of the day, sometimes when we are in our workplaces, we go home at the end of the day and we think to ourselves, whew, it was tough being Black today, or ooh, it was tough being Asian today, or Native today. And it doesn't have to be that our white colleagues said or did something that was offensive. It's because of, as PricewaterhouseCoopers says, we had to leave so much of ourselves behind, right? Now, I love what Ijoma Alua says in her book, So You Want to Talk About Race. She says that people of color know more about white people than they do themselves. See, white people don't often learn about different cultures until they travel internationally. They get ready to take a trip, and then they'll do a little studying, maybe even learn a little bit of the language. But in our own country, they often won't take out the time to learn about the cultural differences. Whereas people of color, we have to learn about what white people expect of us, how to behave, how to act, how to navigate. We have to become multicultural. In other words, navigating different spaces if we want to get ahead. If we want that grade, if we want that promotion or that bank loan or whatever it is. So a part of this work is for us to take out the time and to learn about different cultures. And I want to say that if you are Asian, that doesn't mean that you understand Black culture or Native culture. And the same as if you are Black. It doesn't mean that you understand Latinx culture or Native culture. And so we all have work to do. The other thing is that knowledge is about knowledge of history. right? All of the work that we do is within a US context. So Christina, our work is within a US context, and it's about race. History provides context for what might be going on in a given situation. Even when Anita was just sharing, right? And she's talking about what's going on in our country right now. That her emotion is not just about what is going on right now. If you look at the murder of George Floyd and the reaction, one reaction, which is rioting, and you look at rioting just solely in the context of George Floyd being murdered, then rioting isn't going to make sense to you. But if you look at it in the context of 400 years of the injustice that Black people have experienced at the hands of law enforcement, then maybe the rage might make sense. And maybe some other people might get angry with us. I often hear white people sharing sometimes that they will be in situations where they're just meeting a person of color for the first time. And maybe this is in their personal life where they're in an interracial marriage or dating, and they go to meet that family of color, and they feel that tension. That family might not be very friendly to them. Or in their work situation, they're meeting a person of color for the first time, and they're feeling that tension, and they haven't even done or said anything that was offensive that they can tell. I can tell them what they did wrong, and I don't even need to know the situation. Would you like to know what they did wrong? Nod your head if you'd like to know, because I can take Michelle and talk to her later. Okay. What they did wrong was they showed up white. They showed up white. That's what they did wrong. Now, stay with me on this, because I know this is not easy to hear. I told you I'm going to share some things that run contrary to what you were taught growing up. I'm here to help you all to get better at having conversations with each other so that we're not going to the margins and having the conversation. Just spilled my water. Because as I said, that the only way we can dismantle institutional racism is if we start talking about it. See, it is not you that caused the tension, not you as an individual anyway. If you felt that tension with me, right, it is about what your whiteness represents. See, I don't know you. What I do know is that people who look like you have done harm to people who look like me, past and present. So, and if you said to me, if you were my child's teacher and said, you know, my child is going to have a great, you know, school year, I'm not going to trust that. If you tell me, you know, everybody gets a fair shake when it comes to loans or, you know, showing property, I'm not going to initially trust that. Because all of these things have been said to me, have been said to people who look like me by people who look like you. And it has resulted in harm. Now, I never tell people to not take this personal. There's no way we can talk about racism and not take it personally. But what I would suggest is that if you are white, when you feel that tension, is that you work that to, rather than take it to heart, that you put it out here and you become curious about what might be going on for that person. What might your identity be triggering for that person? Just like I have to do as a multiracial light-skinned person, just like I have to do as a upper middle class person or a person with a higher education, is that our identities mean something. Now, I recognize that for those of you that identify as white, that this might be that moment where it's really hard to hear what it is that I'm saying. So I want to give you an example outside of race. Let's say that I am the last person, or I'm leaving a building and it's dark outside, and I have to walk about 4 or 5 blocks to get to my car, right? So it's dark outside. I have to walk 4 or 5 blocks to get to my car. Let's say Shane, that I turn around, I hear somebody, I turn around and it's Shane. Now I don't know Shane, I just see somebody. Enter into chat. Enter into chat. What am I going to do? It's dark outside. I've got 4 or 5 blocks to go. I don't know this person. What am I going to, I'm going to walk faster, Gwen. I'm going to feel nervous, Taylor. I'm going to get scared. I'm going to be on my guard. I'm going to pull my purse closer. And Joe, I'm going to get out my phone. Now, some people will say I'm going to call the police. Not yet. I don't know if I need to be afraid of Shane on that level. I'm going to call my husband and I'm going to say, honey, if you never see me again, I'm on this street, I'm on 31st and Judkins, and there's a guy behind me. I think he's white, he's got dark hair, he's wearing a gray shirt, right? I'm gonna get my maybe if I have mace, I'm gonna get that out. I might cross the street. And I'm going to get my keys out, Jeff. And I love that they make the keys with the black knob. So be careful, Shane, because I'm going to put them in stabbing position, right? Now, what if Shane sees me doing all of these behaviors? And he yells out to me, hey, lady, don't worry about it. I dated a woman once. Whew. Now I feel safe. Enter into chat. What is it that I am responding to about Shane? What's causing me to do these things? I don't know him. He could have dated a woman once. He could be teaching a class at the local college on feminism, right? What is it about him that's causing me to do these behaviors? He's a man, Eric. Now, let's say Taylor was the one behind me. I'm less likely to have that same reaction. I might be a little cautious, but I'm less likely to have that same reaction. And let me ask you this, just nod your head. Have women ever done harm to other women when we've been in vulnerable positions? Absolutely. But more commonly, it's men, right? Now, what if instead of getting my keys out and my phone and walking faster and all those things you identified, what if I turned around, closed the gap between Shane and I, introduced myself to him and asked him, told him, hey, look, I'm afraid I've got 4 or 5 blocks to go to my car. Would you walk me the rest of the way? If I was your daughter, your sister, your wife, your friend, your mother, and I told you that it was dark outside and I was the only one on the street, and I asked this strange man that I didn't know to walk me to my car, what would you tell me? What would you say to me? What would you say? Are you crazy? I can't believe you did that. That's not safe. Don't you ever do that again, right? See, even men will educate their daughters, the women in their lives. They will remind them of what they need to do to stay safe, right? Think about this. Even men will. They don't take it personally. They're not saying, well, I'm a guy. Why would you treat me that way? They understand that there is this reality that exists. One of the things that I think that people of color struggle with is that why is it that in our nation, we can talk about just about anything other than racism? We don't really have a problem of talking about sexism. We know that women are objectified, that they get paid less for doing the same jobs that men do. We don't argue about classism. We acknowledge that there is a wealth gap that exists. But the moment that we want to talk about racism, all of a sudden we're playing the race card. We're making too much out of it. It's a thing of the past. See, I don't think it's that white people don't acknowledge racism or that white people have a hard time talking about racism. I think it's good, kind, loving, moral, ethical white people that have a hard time with it. And I think it's because that good, kind, loving, moral, ethical white people, that when they begin to entertain the racial realities that exist for people of color, they start to feel shame and guilt. And when they start to feel shame and guilt, it means that something is being touched on. And if they were to continue to lean in and acknowledge, as was said earlier, that people of color are treated differently than white people, then that good, kind, loving, moral, ethical white person would have to be a part of the change. They'd have to do something. I'm honest with you, I miss ignorance is bliss. Like, I finally know what that means. Like, I want to rest. I want to give it a break, but I can't. So what, and I'm already forgetting his name, it's a new name for me, but just even acknowledging it is doing something, And I recognize there are people out there that don't care, that do believe in the supremacy of white people. I don't assume that about most people that I come across every day. I don't assume that about you all, right? Skills are learning how to engage. Just like you learned how to drive, right? When you were learning how to drive, it was so scary. You were gripping that steering wheel tight and you probably thought, I'm never going to learn how to do this. There were so many things that you had to keep in mind, Scott, all at once. Do you remember this? You had to keep in mind the rear view mirror, the side view mirror, the gas, the brake, the speed limit, the pedestrians, the cars coming at you, the parked cars. I mean, there were so many things, but you got better. If you know how to drive, if you didn't let your fear get a hold of you, you eventually learned how to drive where it's second nature. I learned how to drive using a stick shift. I haven't driven a stick shift in 20 years. Latasha, I think I could still drive away in a stick shift. I'd sputter a little bit, but but once you learn, the rules never change. Learning how to talk about race is similar to that. It can feel sometimes very overwhelming. Now, the difference is that learning how to drive is a technical skill. Learning how to have conversations about race is an adaptive skill, meaning that how you engage one person, even from the same group, can be different than how you engage another person. Let's take language as an example. You go to call someone Native American, they say, don't call me Native American, I'm American Indian, don't call me American Indian, I'm Indigenous, don't call me Indigenous, call me by my tribal name, call me First Nations, I'm Alaska Native. You get it? You go to call someone Hispanic, they say, don't call me Hispanic, I'm Chicano. You call someone Chicano, they say, I'm Latino. You call someone Latino, they say, I'm Latinx. You're like, what is that? Right? Let's slow it down a little bit. You go to call someone Black, and they say, don't call me Black, I'm African American. Now, some people believe that race work is political correctness. It's about political correctness. It's not, by the way, right? But let's just say this person thinks that it's about political correctness. That means they're going to try to memorize that. It's African American, it's African American. They probably got Post-it notes all over their house, right? Now, the next time they go to engage a Black person, they remember what happened the last time, and they're feeling a little bit more confident because they've got those Post-it notes, but they remember that that person wasn't very nice to them. They don't want to have that repeat experience, so they engage the person cautiously, and they refer to them as African American. And what does that person say? Don't call me African American, I'm Black. Now, a lot of people at this point will throw up their hands and think, those people can't make up their minds, right? Those people will get you in trouble too, by the way, right? What if instead of thinking that this is political correctness and trying to get it exactly right, what if in these moments when you made mistakes, when you offended someone, that you leaned in? You said, hey, can you tell me why you prefer Chicano? Or why you prefer your tribal name? I just talked with someone and they told me they preferred Black, and now you're telling me that you prefer African American. What is the difference for you? See, and these are the moments for me, whether it was around ability, whether it was around class or age or race, these are those moments where I learn. I read lots of books, watch lots of documentaries. I'm always trying to grow and learn, but I'll tell you, it's in the mistakes that I make that I never forget. right? It's the times and the moments that I leaned in, right? I think our culture is very interesting. If you think about it, language is always evolving. I remember when I was a kid, if you called someone queer, those were fighting words. Now people identify as queer. When my mother was a firefighter, she wasn't a firefighter. In those days, she was a fireman, right? When we know better, we begin to do better. So just like with anything else, like with gender or class, we begin to change the language because we see that there's harm in language and we recognize that language matters. Okay. Now, the last body of work is action and advocacy. Action and advocacy is, what are you going to do with what you've come to understand? Action and advocacy is the systems change work. It is the work that individual institutions do to undo institutional racism so that they can contribute to changing and addressing systemic racism. So institutional racism is how an institution functions, and systemic racism is how those institutions function together to create kind of like a, no matter where you turn, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in law enforcement, whether it's in real estate, people are experiencing racism, and those things work together, right? Now, if you look at even just some of these images, and somebody had said this before, which is that within the lifetime of many people in this training, some of these things were happening. We are old enough to remember whites only water fountains, right? White only, only whites could go to sit in certain restaurants. Like, this isn't eons ago, Jim Crow law. Because we have a Black president or Oprah Winfrey is a billionaire, that doesn't now make everything level. We've got some work to do. Now, it's okay that we took a little time during the discussion, but I'm not going to put you in another group because I have a couple of things that I want to share with you. And if we have extra time, I will take some time for questions. What I want you to understand is that this work is a journey. It is not an event. You will never arrive. There are cultures within cultures, and it's always shifting and changing. This work is active work. It doesn't happen, we don't change our culture through silence. Silence actually is a way to collude with racism. We don't change racism because our best friend is. We don't even change racism because we are. We all have to be intentional in this. Institutional racism existed long before any of us were born. Because it was here before we were born doesn't mean that we don't play a role in changing it. I actually think with all the pain and all the harm and all the things that are happening in our country, at the same time, we are at an exciting time. We are at an exciting time where we have the opportunity to make history. And Keller Williams is not going to change if you put this work on the shoulders of people of color. It's not going to change if you put it on the HR director's shoulder or leadership shoulders. It's not even going to change if people of color say it's not their job to educate white people. Now, we'll talk more about that in another training. What I'm saying is that we have to come together and be active and intentional in being a part of the change that we want to see. All of us. And if you want to know what you can do, I just shared it with you. I just shared it with you. Here's a quick glance at it. Awareness of self, knowledge of others, and skills. That's the interpersonal work. That's how I engage you, Christy, how you engage me, how we engage each other. That's the work that we do to develop our lens so that we're seeing things in the same way. We do that work so that then collectively we can work together in that last pillar to change systems, right? What questions, just really briefly, I might be able to take one question. What do you have, what questions do you have where I can clarify something that I've said? That's all I can take right now, is where I've said something, because you can't always hear yourself speak, where you'd like further understanding, or something that I said that doesn't make sense, because I want to share two other pieces that I think are going to be helpful to you in engaging one another.
Yes, don't you think there's laws that's in place that embedded in racism from government?
Oh, absolutely, right? And so this is, who is speaking? Because I don't see you.
This is Ryan Garnett.
Absolutely, yes. Ryan, what are some laws that are embedded in institutional racism?
Like you see, like older laws, like back in the days, or the 15th or 14th Amendment, that Black folks are still only 3/5 human, even to this day. You know, racism has not changed. It just only redesigned racism.
Absolutely. So pretty much in every system, right? Healthcare, in the judicial system, in our education system. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're in agreement on that. You had said, Ryan, so don't you think that racism exists? Was there something that I said that made you maybe think that I don't think that racism is embedded in our systems, or were you just wanting others to know that was there something that wasn't clear about something that I said? What made you bring that up?
Oh, I think I might have been misclear of you. I wanted to say that, you know, I think it starts with government and system, because a lot of white people want to follow systems, but they don't understand that the system has work. It's like we have two Americas. We have America that's mainstream America, and America has a separate America for us only.
Okay,
you know,
so Brian,
it's just like
this. Who's in charge? Who's in charge of those systems? Who has the majority power over the government system, the healthcare system, the judicial system? Who's mostly in power over those systems?
Rich white men.
Yeah, rich white man. Yeah.
So if those systems are going to be changed, right? What do we have to do to get them to change? Because, and here's what I'm getting at, and this is why I'm saying that it's important that we look at these first three areas, because if we don't get more allies on board where they're understanding how these systems are functioning, and even people of color, because again, I will argue that there are many people of color that don't understand how those systems are operating. We can't get to that fourth pillar of dismantling racism. We have to first understand it in order to change it.
Let me see, my thing.
Hold on, Ryan. We can't even get to the conversation about it. Are you all
That's true. That's true.
And so when people are saying, tell me what to do, I'm saying, become aware of your bias, understand how you've been socialized, learn about other people's experiences, practice talking about it, and then together we can address the systems.
The problem is people want to be right.
Okay, well,
and you know, and other people, you know, and the people that want to be right, they want to try to prove a point to make others wrong instead of just listening.
So that's one of the problems.
A part of communication is a great deal of listening.
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt you.
So
this is what I'm talking about as a group. I need to still continue to share some things that are really important, because that's not the only issue, and we're not going to resolve everything right now. But what I hear, Ryan, and I'm hearing this from you, is that you're ready to talk about this. You've been ready to talk about this. You've been learning about it, and this is an opportunity to help Keller and Williams not just have one person over here or one person over here or 5 people over here. This is an opportunity for you all to understand it together. And I'm including you in this. And I'm hoping that you are hearing some things that maybe you hadn't thought about before. So let me finish my presentation because it's going to take me to the end. But I will say I agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree with you that institutional racism is very alive and well. Okay, so turn your mic off. Turn your mic off. So you've probably seen this image. This is the first image that came out around that helped to explain the difference between equity and equality. Now, I don't recommend that if you haven't seen it and it's helpful to you that you share this image with anyone, because this one has some problems with it. Not going to go through what's problematic about it, but I will say that if you Google equity versus equality images, you're going to find some really awesome ones. I was the first director of equity and race. I used to get these terms mixed up. Okay, this image helped me to be very clear about when I wanted to talk about equality and when I wanted to talk about equity. Now, normally I would interact with you through chat, but I'm going to just go through this really quickly because I really want to get to that last slide. Equality is everybody gets the same thing, and that's not fair, right? It's not necessarily fair. We don't necessarily want everybody to get the same thing. Equity is that people get what they need. I think the field metaphorically represents opportunity, the fence, barriers, and the boxes, the support or resources, okay? I think that height metaphorically represents privilege and our legacy of institutional racism and the privilege that comes with that legacy. Now, if we were to talk about gender, I would say that the height represents sexism or classism. So I want you to think about this. So my family is first generation. My husband and I are first generation upper middle class. If we're able to send our kids to the schools that we think will provide them with the best education, so they're in private school, we send them across town, it increases the likelihood that they'll get into the best what? Colleges. And if they get into the best colleges, it increases the likelihood that they'll get the best what? Jobs. And if they decide they're going to have children, then they'll be in the position to send their kids to the best schools, get into the best colleges, and get the best jobs. Whites have been at this unfair advantage for generations, right? And people of color have been at an unfair disadvantage. Now, when organizations recognize that equity needs to occur in order to address institutional racism, what this person will often say is, that's not fair. Or I worked hard for my box. If they want a box, they should work hard for theirs too. Without any knowledge of the fact that, again, for generations, they have been given a head start. Is this making sense to you? Nod your head if you're following me. Okay, this isn't about this person being a bad person. This is about the systems that have been in place and the legacy of white men running this country that have created that unlevel playing field. And generations following, white men and white women have benefited from that. Now, white women not as much as white men, but they've benefited from this. Right? Now, when we try to talk about it, whites will commonly take the universal approach to race conversations. The universal approach is where whites will say, we're all human, we all bleed. Why do we have to talk about differences? Talking about differences just divide us. It's not talking about differences that divide us. It's not talking about it that divides us, and the approach that we're taking to race conversations that divide us. Now, I am human. In fact, you're all human. Before coming on to this, training, I didn't think to myself, I wonder who's going to be a human being and who won't be, right? Like, that's just a given. Why are we even talking about whether or not someone is a human being? Now, we keep this as a part of the conversation because we know, Renee, that not everybody in our country is treated as a human being, but that's not what the conversation is about. More commonly, whites will take the individual approach. The individual approach is essentially the colorblind approach, right? Now, let me just pause and say, I think that when a white person tells me personally in my personal life that they don't notice race or that they don't see differences, that comes from a good place. I think that they're trying to convey to me that they're not going to let my race get in the way, that they're not going to be racist towards me, that they don't think of me as inferior because of my race. And I think what people of color want to know, I know what I want to know is, why do I have to not be Black in order for you to do those things? In other words, what I'm saying is, why does an important part of who I am have to go away in order for you to treat me fairly? Can't both be true. See, it's not that, I think hating people who see race differences as negative, I think that's easy. I even think to some degree, it's easy to pretend like we don't notice race. The work of the 21st century and what is harder is to notice racial differences and see those differences as positive. And the reason that that's harder is because we're being bombarded all the time through media and other ways, stereotypes about different groups. And we have to fight those stereotypes. Now, this is a socialization that happens at a very early age. Let's say, so you might not know this, but at 3 years old, that's the age when children begin to ask you all those questions where you realize you're not as smart as you thought you were, right? Anybody have a child in their life about that age, that's when they start asking you all those questions, right? Let's say there's a white child and she's riding the bus, Michael, right? And she says, "Mommy, why is that man so chocolate?" The chocolate man is not bothered by her question. He knows that when little kids are confronted with difference, these are the kinds of questions that they ask. Who's he paying attention to? He's paying attention to the mother. He's thinking, let me sit back and see how she's going to handle this. What do we as parents often do the moment that our children point out differences loud enough for the person who's different to hear? What do we do? Let me see it. You don't even need to turn your mic on. What do? We shush, Heidi. What's the message that that child gets? One message is we don't talk about differences. The deeper message, the hidden message, is there's something wrong with being different. If there wasn't something wrong with being different, then why can't we talk about it, right? And what happens is that children of color at an early age begin to internalize inferiority, that there's something wrong with being a person of color. There's a reason why skin bleaching cream is sold around the world. Why Blacks spend more money on hair care products than any other ethnic group. Why, if you're Asian, you can go online and figure out how to temporarily widen your eyes. And while we're internalizing inferiority, guess what white people are internalizing? Superiority. Because when we say that we're all the same or to not notice differences, are we saying we're all Native or we're all Latinx? Really, in that there is a message to assimilate into whiteness. Rather than normalizing in that moment with young children, yes, that person, you're noticing differences. That person is chocolate. And what color are we? And with a 3-year-old, you might use flavors of ice cream, vanilla or caramel. And Molly, if you have children, even children of your same race might have a different tone. But we're making it like it's a secret. And what happens is then whites grow up and they'll say anything about a person other than their race. You see that person over there in the purple hat and the blue shoes and the green coat? Oh, the Asian one. Like, why didn't you just say so? They know they're Asian. Now, I'm not saying to say race for no reason. My son, about 3 weeks ago, he came up into my office. I was in the middle of a training like this. And he says, "Mom, there's a Black kid at the door that wants to sell us something." And in this moment, I thought to myself, Eric, why is he saying their race? It doesn't add anything to the story. It doesn't inform me in any way. But if you called me up, Connie, and you said, I've got this situation that I want to talk to you about, I'm wondering if you can help me think it through, one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you, what is their race? Because race helps to inform me of what might be going on in any given situation. So yes, I'm human, and yes, I'm an individual, but that's not what the conversation is about. So whites typically tend to take that approach, where people of color tend to take the group approach. And this is where we are at a disconnect, right? The group approach is where we look at, what does it mean to be a member of a group? What is it like to be a woman in this country? Who is, does the same work as men but get paid less? What is it like to be an immigrant? What is it like to be gay or queer? What is it like to be a person of color? What is it like to be Asian or Latinx and have people tell you, you speak such good English, even though you're second or third generation? I have this Asian person tell me that when people tell her she speaks good English, she says to them, thank you, you do too. I think that's a great response, right? What is it like in your own country to be seen as a foreigner? But if you are Russian and are white, you are one generation away from being seen as American. In other words, once you have children or there's no accent, your children will never be asked, where are you really from? Whereas when you're Latinx or Asian, it doesn't matter how many generations you're here, you are always seen as an outsider. Now let's take Black Lives Matter to look at this model, because that's something that is going on in our country right now that white people are trying to figure out, like, how do we talk about this, right? So Black Lives Matter. I want you to enter into chat responses to my questions. Black Lives Matter is a group approach, right? So as a Black woman, I've actually never been racially profiled by the police, right? I've never, like, if I ever got pulled over, it was because I was speeding or I was doing something illegal that I shouldn't have been doing. Right? But I can still have a conversation about Black Lives Matter or the collective experience of Black people. What is a reaction to Black Lives Matter? What is something that people will say in reaction to Black Lives Matter? Okay, thank you, Cole. All lives matter. Now, which approach is all lives matter? Is that a universal? Is that an individual, or is that a group? All lives matter. That's a universal, Christine. Now let me ask you this. Nod your head. Do all lives matter?
Of course they do.
All right, some of you are taking too long. Now, I'm not asking you to think about this deeply. Don't be thinking about Hitler or whatever. Just in general, do all lives matter? Come on now.
Yeah.
Right. So why are we even talking about whether or not all lives matter? We're already all in agreement on that. Now, when you, sometimes people of color will hear a reaction to all lives matter. Someone will say, this is again, a white person might say, my spouse is a police officer, my daughter is a police officer, my friend is a police officer, or I'm a police officer, and that person is a good person and they've never done harm, and I resent you saying, that Black Lives Matter. My friend risks their lives every day. What approach is it when you point out a friend or somebody that you know? Is that a universal and absolutely, Taylor? It's an individual. What's her name? Candace Owens. If you don't know who Candace Owens is, she's a Black woman that is an individual voice. She does not represent the collective. Now, what is another reaction to Black Lives Matter? So we've got all lives matter. We got people pointing to the individual people in law enforcement. By the way, what whites forget when they point out to individual people in their lives, they forget that Black people have friends and family who are in law enforcement, right? So we're not saying that individual is not okay. Okay, so Anita, absolutely, blue lives matter. Is Blue Lives Matter, is that a universal, an individual, or a group approach? Okay, Irwin, I think, Irwin. Absolutely, it's a group approach, but it is another group. It is another group. So this reminds me of when I bring up something with my husband, like I've got a problem with something that he's doing or does. I tell you, Eva, 9 times out of 10, I'm not even exaggerating here, he'll say things like, well, what about when you do? Now, what we're talking about is his issue. It's like a red herring. We're no longer, Lori, talking about what I brought to his attention, right? Now, let me just ask you something. Do blue lives matter? Do blue lives matter? Come on now, everybody. Absolutely, blue lives matter. What would we do if there was no law enforcement? Law enforcement serves a purpose. I can't imagine every day that I go to work, I don't know if I'm going to come home to my family or not, right? That my work is a dangerous job. Of course, blue lives matter. But that is not what we're talking about. And what happens is that every time a person goes to the universal, all lives matter, the individual, they name somebody in their life, or they go to another group, I want you to know that you are actually colluding with racism. You are actually helping to maintain systems of oppression. Because while we're talking about whether or not all lives matter, now we've got to talk about whether or not that individual friend that you know is a good person, or whether or not blue lives matter. All the while, when it comes to Black people, people will shoot first and ask questions later. And I mean that literally, and I mean that figuratively. I'm not trying to make white people feel bad. I'm trying to help you understand the realities that exist for people of color. See, one of the things that I know in talking about race is that when we start to talk about race, people of color are trying to talk about the collective, and whites will go to the individual. When white people go to the individual, it becomes about who you are as an individual. One of the reasons that whites go to who they are as an individual is because it's part of the privilege of what it means to be white. You get to be an individual, right? Now, one way that you can test this out, this thing that I'm talking with you about, is if you identify as white and you've been having a hard time with me saying white people this entire presentation, it is probably because you are used to being seen as an individual. See, we can't talk about racism if we can't talk about not only the collective experience of what it's like to be Indigenous, Asian, Latinx, or Black, but also what it means to be white. And so I am bringing white folks in this conversation to the collective. But see, whites have had the privilege of being seen as an individual. And so when we talk about the collective, they'll go to the individual because they've been used to being seen as essentially innocent of any stereotype, of any label, until they prove themselves as guilty. And let me say this again. The reason that whites go to the individual is because in our country, they are seen as innocent until they prove themselves as guilty. People of color, we would love to be seen as individuals. We would love that. We are guilty. We are guilty until we prove ourselves as innocent. See, first we shoot Ahmaud Arbery, then we determine whether or not he's innocent. See, first we assume, I haven't yet memorized this guy yesterday. Then we shoot him first, and then we figure out. And this is what we're trying to invite people in to talking about. And I want to say here that I don't believe that all people of color are on the same page with the collective, right? What I'm saying is, as it relates to themes, that typically the conflict becomes between whites and people of color. So if my white brothers and sisters and those not on the gender binary want to do something, do that work in awareness, knowledge, and skills so that you can move to the collective, not make it about you as an individual, make it about you as an identity. Most people of color have experienced, have the hardest conversations with the people they work with. I want to thank you all for your time, and I want to open it up to questions that you might have or thoughts that you might have. And I'd like to really open it up to someone that has not had an opportunity to share. Yeah, please. So Carrie, I see Carrie, and Tess, did you have a thought? Tess, did you also have a thought? Did you raise your hand? Carrie, go ahead and get started. And Tess, no, you did not. Okay. Carrie, what's going on for you?
Thank you, Dr. Hollins. I think really right now, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on kind of pulling together the idea of collectivism. If we, you know, a lot of us across races are wanting to be a part of a bigger group that goes beyond any race in trying to move us forward as a society where we're all, our individual differences are honored and recognized, but not used as a way to divide us. And so I'm just really curious to hear your thoughts on how we do that, or what you would suggest on ways to signal to others across, even within our own race and across racial boundaries, that we're wanting to be a part of that collectivism so that we can find each other and do the work as a larger group.
And so Carrie, I'm going to need a little bit of clarification because I don't know what you mean when you say like our individual is seen as we're a part of the collective. So say a little bit more. What do you mean?
Sure. So I think I tried to articulate it in the chat, but bear with me. I see kind of look back over human history, and I feel like it's a human nature tendency for us to be drawn towards those who are familiar to ourselves or who look like ourselves or who we can relate to. And that, it seems like, at least throughout history, has been primarily driven off of physical similarities. That's what
So like, that's a bias we have. Absolutely. That's why when you look at leadership, they often resemble each other, right? Because there's this like me bias, and it's unconscious often. Okay, so keep going.
So my assumption is that part of this work is to move kind of, I don't know if it's move away from that, but to evolve out of that so that we see commonalities across those different physicalities. And we're trying to kind of gather ourselves around a common goal or a desire to move beyond that race and see each other for our humanity, but still recognizing that we're all in different spots. We all have different areas to grow in, and how to bind ourselves or come together in that desire to move forward as a larger group.
We are nowhere near being able to move beyond race, and it won't happen within our lifetime, right? So what this work is about is, see, if you look at what happened to people who immigrate here from Europe as an example, in order to get ahead, they had to lose a part of their identity, so that white people often don't even know, or they're not even connected anymore. I mean, this is a huge loss to what it means to be Irish or Italian. I'm not saying everyone, I'm saying it costs you something to gain something else. And what people of color are saying is, I want you to notice my race. I just don't want you to see it as inferior. I want to value my cultural differences. I want you to notice these differences and you see these differences as value added. what I bring to it. So we're not trying to move beyond race. We want for race to stop creating the unlevel playing field. Is that making sense to you? And the only way that we can get there is if we acknowledge, as the person said earlier on, that racism is still alive today, right? And that bias still exists. So it's not to move beyond it. It's not to just look at similarities. It's to recognize like there is value added in your being a diverse workplace if you welcome that diversity into it. Right. Yeah. Now it's 4 o'clock. So I know that Dee Dee or Tracy is going to send you a evaluation electronically. It's important that you complete that evaluation. Like that is feedback for me. That is feedback for all the work that the team has done, the group of people have done to put this together. So please take a moment to just give some feedback. I'm going to look at chat to see what you all have said. I can stay on for about maybe 10 minutes. Let me before I do that.
Dr. Hollins, Erin Jocelyn's been waiting. She's
Okay,
wanting to ask a question. So
hold on. I do get that. I need to just check my calendar because I only have until 4 and I need to make sure that I don't have anything else following, and then I will stay for a little bit more conversation for those of you that want to. And those of you that can't, our time is over, and I know you got children to be with, and I know you've got things going on, and so don't worry about it. Yeah, so I do have a little bit of time. So Erin, what is your comment, your thought, your question?
Hi, thank you so much for the past 3 hours of your time and energy. And thank you to all of those that made this happen and who have shown up. I guess where I'm still a little stuck is how to have more of these conversations. I've been doing a little bit of work within our market center with other women. And then I noticed that on social media, there are conversations happening, but I don't trust that I'm able to really converse with people where there can be some real change. It's usually attracting like minds or people who are already doing the work or willing to do the work. And I guess I want to know, how do I have more of the messy, honest conversations where there can be more productivity?
Yeah. So let me ask you this, Erin. Have you been like doing some work around like you understand privilege and you understand microaggressions and you understand the history? You know, have you? I'm not saying you arrived. None of us have arrived, right? I'm not an expert. I'm just sharing with you. I have some expertise. Have you been doing some of that other work that I just described?
I have been.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the reason that I ask that is that this is not a workshop for strategies, because a lot of people for the first time aren't even recognizing, they don't know yet that just becoming aware is doing something, or just listening and believing is doing something. And so I want to say that to say that this is a common question that gets asked. Now, so are you asking, because even again, keeping in mind this work is adaptive. Are we talking about having conversations with children? Are we talking about having conversations with the family members who are overtly racist? Are we talking about how do we have it on social media? Are we talking about the person who like they just didn't know, they just weren't aware and they're saying color blindness? Because it all matters, right? Who I'm engaging is going to matter how I engage them. Right? So tell me just what are you thinking in this moment? Because I can't cover this all, and I'm going to give you a tool.
Well, I guess are the conversations, I keep having to put them into air quotes because they're not, I mean, they're typed and you don't talk to people face to face through social media. Are those productive? Are they leading to anything? I'm sometimes met with people who will give me these typical responses of like, Blue Lives Matter. The guy shouldn't have been running away from the police.
This is helpful. So now I can, okay. So one of the strategies that we teach in our strategy workshop, which I typically won't do until I've worked with a group a couple of times so we can do some awareness and knowledge work, is that what happens is that you are likely the one that's doing all the work. That you try to convince that person the way that you see things, that we instantly go into educating them. Let me tell you what Blue Lives Matter means, and let me tell you what it's about, and let me tell you why you got it wrong, right? But instead, what if you had them doing the work? What if instead of thinking that you're going to move them from A to Z, that you planted some seeds, you asked some questions to get them thinking about what it is that they're saying. See, I get exhausted doing all the work trying to teach people. I'm doing my work. Let me see if you're doing your work. When someone says all lives matter, you might say, tell me more about what you mean by all lives matter. So what's your understanding of Black Lives Matter? Like, I'm not really, and be honest, be gentle. Like, I don't get how people got to all lives matter from Black Lives. So really ask it with genuine curiosity. Help me I'm really confused. So, are you thinking that that people are saying that all lives don't matter? Where did you where did you get that from? Like, point to me, show me, help me to understand that. Because what they're going to find is they're not going to be able to say anything. So there's nothing that says, right? Just like there's nothing that said Kaepernick was saying that veterans weren't honored, right? Like, give me something, help me to see it, because I want to see it like you see it. Maybe I got something wrong here. And then ask them, they say, well, just by saying Black Lives Matter, help me again, help me understand. And you do it with honesty and authenticity. Now, what's going to be hard for you and other people is they're going to be saying some things that trigger you.
Yeah.
Right? They're going to be saying things, but you just keep asking questions. Help me understand. I'm not sure. I'm not clear. And then there's always this kind of bridge. So I like to leave people where if I get really angry, then it becomes about my anger and no longer about the issue. So if I start to get angry, then it's like, it looks like we're in different places. I just want to go ahead. Let's just go ahead and end this and hope I left them some things to think about. But if I stay with the conversation, I'll try to say like an anchor. Would you be open to hearing my understanding of Black Lives Matter? Would you be curious? So using words like curious or open. I was open with you. I was curious with you. Now, would you be curious with me? And the moment I go to share, if they show that they're not really open, like I was trying to be with them, I would say, you know what? I know you said that you were open, but I don't really sense that you're open. It sounds like to me that you know what you know because you know, or it sounds like to me that you've already have your mind made up. And then I don't engage that person anymore.
That was my question. When do you let it go?
When I'm doing all the work.
Yeah. And it's kind of the same with trying to engage people in this conversation. For instance, like in this company, for those who didn't show up today or prioritize it, do you just keep the focus on yourself and the work you're doing and try to
You are not in control. You are not in control of what other people do with what it is that you offer. And we end up in these power struggles. And if you research critical mass, now you'll see that numbers are all different. But critical mass is actually very small. To change your organization, you really only need like 30% of your organization on board moving this work forward. You don't need everybody. And so you just want to get a critical mass. So what I do is there are people who don't want to learn, and I have no magic. There is no magic. I'm here to engage the white person or the person of color that just didn't know, or they don't understand it in this way. And once they do know, they might feel some resistance. They might feel some defensiveness. That's normal. They might feel some anger or some shame or guilt, but they're not closed off. See, that's where I get exhausted. And that's where, like, there are too many other people out there that are open. Some of you are going to hear this workshop, this presentation completely different than some of your colleagues, right? And as you're engaging each other, James, when someone says, well, I felt like she was shaming white people, or I felt like, don't argue in my defense. Say, what about it? Help me understand. What was it that she said? What do you think she was trying to say? Even though I hear that that felt defensive to you, what do you think she was trying to convey? If you were to convey it, how would you convey that differently? And a lot of times what you find is when you ask people questions and you hold them accountable, they actually don't really have a better way of thinking of it. Like they just know because they know, right? And then you leave, exhausted, But anyway, are there any other just thoughts or comments? Bruce, you were keeping track. I don't know if you had to leave, but
No, I'm here. Can I just make a comment? And that is, one, I want to thank you, Dr. Hollins, for this time. Dee Dee, Connie, Alex, for helping put this together. You guys are awesome. And I want to thank everybody on this call for being willing and to take this journey with us, right? I mean, like you said, this isn't going to be easy, and we know that it's going to be messy, and we're going to make mistakes. And I just want to thank you all for being a part of this, because we want to move in this direction. We want to do it as a region. I believe Gary Keller wants to do it as a company, and I believe we have an opportunity to make changes. So thank you all for being on this call. I really appreciate you. And we're going to talk about how we can continue this journey. And hopefully, Dr. Hollins, you'll be a part of that with us. We'd love to have that.
thank you all for your time. Thank you for your commitment to justice. Thank you, Tony. Thank you all. You all can log off whenever you're ready. I know you have things to do. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Dee Dee. Oh, yeah. Thank you, Lene. Thank you, Michelle. Y'all have a good evening. Hopefully I got lots of, gave you a lot of food for thought. Keep having these conversations, Renee. Don't give up, Cheryl. I appreciate you all. Thank you, Molly, Michelle. Yeah, thank you, James. Can't do it alone. Y'all make up the critical mass. Thank you, Tony, Christina, and Katie. Shay, thank you. Thanks, Shay and Carrie. It's not easy, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. Thank you, Bruce.